I didn't know the Army started handing out participation trophies for sniper school, Lieutenant Caleb Sterling sneered. His voice cut through the heavy, humid air of the FOB briefing room like a blunt blade. Sergeant Savannah Ghost Vance sat at the far edge of the wooden bench, her small frame casting a long, still shadow against the cinderblock walls. The sharp, metallic scent of gun oil clung to her uniform like a second skin. Above them, the rhythmic thrum of the overhead fans beat a slow pulse against the stifling desert heat. Savannah's calloused fingertips traced the gritty texture of fine sand that had settled into the cracks of the briefing table. Sterling continued his loud-mouthed mockery, dismissing her silence as fear and her petite build as a tactical liability. He saw an underdog. He did not see the lethal veteran who had already lived 3 lifetimes behind a long-range glass. She let the insults wash over her like the dust outside the wire. Sterling had no idea that her stillness was the deadliest thing in the entire room, and before the story was over, he would learn exactly what it cost to underestimate a ghost. Fictional stories. Real courage. Savannah Vance was 26 years old, though the deep lines at the corners of her eyes suggested she had lived far more than 26 winters. In the high-octane, testosterone-heavy environment of the forward operating base, she was a ghost in more ways than just her call sign. To the rest of her unit, she was an enigma, a quiet, petite woman who rarely spoke and never bragged about her record. Most of the men in her platoon saw her stillness as a lack of confidence. They mistook her small frame for a lack of physical grit and her measured words for inexperience. To them, she was just another body filling a slot, a token placement they didn't yet believe in. Lieutenant Sterling was not the only one who looked through her rather than at her. They saw the gear, the high-end rifle, and the uniform, but they missed the lethality of the person underneath. They did not see the decades of discipline etched into her marrow from a life spent in the field. Even in the relative safety of the mess hall, Savannah was never truly off the clock. Her eyes moved constantly, scanning the perimeter of every room she entered. It was a survival instinct honed over thousands of hours spent alone in thick brush with only a long glass for company. Whenever she stepped outside the heavy steel doors of the command center, her gaze instinctively dropped to the sparse patches of yellowed grass. She watched the way the blades bent in the heat, calculating wind speed and direction without even realizing she was doing it. A slight, almost imperceptible tilt of her head tracked a shift in the breeze that no one else noticed. These tiny mechanical adjustments were the secret language of a master marksman. To an untrained observer like Sterling, it looked like a nervous tick. To Savannah, it was the technical difference between a successful mission and catastrophic failure at 1,000 yards. Her mind often drifted back to crisp autumn mornings in the rugged Appalachian mountains of her youth. She could still smell the damp earth and the sharp, clean scent of pine needles crushed under her boots. Her father, a legendary marksman with a chest full of medals from a dozen conflicts, always stood directly behind her. "Steady your breath, Savannah," he had whispered, his voice as calm and steady as a mountain lake. "The rifle is just a tool made of cold steel and polished wood." He placed a weathered hand on her shoulder, a gesture of both support and solemn instruction. "Your greatest weapon isn't the glass or the trigger," he told her during those long afternoon sessions. "It is the mind that makes the decision when to let the hammer fall." He taught her that the final decision was the heaviest burden any soldier could carry into the field. It was never about the mechanical ability to hit a moving target at distance. It was about having the wisdom and restraint to know if that shot should be taken at all. "Once you release that lead, you can never call it back into the barrel," he warned with a grim look. "That choice belongs to you and you alone for the rest of your life." Now, years later in a dry and dusty war zone, Savannah carried those words like a lead weight in her rucksack. Being a woman in a male-dominated MOS meant she was always under microscopic scrutiny. Every minor mistake would be magnified. Every success would be dismissed as luck. She did not want to be a trailblazer or a poster child. She simply wanted to do the job she was born to do with a level of professionalism that left no room for doubt. The redacted pages of her service record were not kept for vanity, but for the protection of her own peace of mind. She listened to Sterling's arrogant and flawed briefing plan, spotting the tactical gaps like cracks in a dirty windshield. She chose not to speak up yet. Her voice would only be drowned out by the noise of his ego. There was something else in the briefing that drew her focus more than Sterling's posturing. The intelligence officer had mentioned, almost as a footnote, that Malik, their target, had made initial contact with northern provincial representatives just 48 hours earlier. Nobody else seemed to register what that meant. Savannah did. The timing was not a coincidence. It never was. She focused on the cycle of her own breathing, slowing her heart rate until she was as still as the stone of the mountains. Her time to prove herself was rapidly approaching. Soon, the men around her would realize that the quietest person in the room was often the most dangerous one there. The unit moved into the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush, a landscape of broken shale and vertical misery. The air was thin, tasting of dry stone and the faint metallic hint of a coming storm. Every breath felt like inhaling powdered glass as they pushed toward the last known location of Malik. Lieutenant Sterling led the file, his breathing heavy but his ego still intact. He turned back every few minutes, his eyes narrowing as he checked the line of his team. His gaze always seemed to linger on Savannah, who moved with a fluid, rhythmic grace that defied the weight of her gear. "Keep up, Vance," Sterling barked, his voice echoing too loudly against the granite walls. "This isn't a Sunday stroll through a park in the USA. If you can't carry the weight, maybe you should have stayed in the rear with the gear." Savannah didn't offer a rebuttal. She adjusted the straps of her rucksack and focused on the crunch of boots on gravel and the steady thud of her own heart. Then Sterling did something that surprised her. He stopped the file, dropped to a knee, and pointed out a natural choke point 200 meters ahead. "If I were staging an ambush, I'd use that draw," he said to Miller, his voice suddenly tactical and stripped of arrogance. "Wide right, single file, keep noise discipline." It was a sound call, probably the best he had made all day. Savannah filed it away. Maybe there was something under the bluster after all. But the moment passed quickly, and the altitude seemed to bring the arrogance back with it. His orders became more erratic as they climbed higher. The unit's fatigue was growing, pulling at their limbs and clouding their judgment. As they climbed, the vegetation thinned, leaving them exposed against the gray and ochre landscape. Savannah's eyes never left the ridgeline above them, scanning for any break in the skyline. She noticed the local birds had gone suddenly quiet, their morning calls replaced by an eerie, heavy silence that pressed down on her like a second atmosphere. She saw a small pile of rocks, a cairn, positioned a little too deliberately to be natural. It was a ranging marker left by scouts to bracket the trail they were walking. Her thumb brushed the safety of her rifle, a reflexive gesture that went unnoticed by the lieutenant. Staff Sergeant Miller was starting to share her unease. He caught her eye and held it for just a second, reading the tension in her jaw. He knew the look. He'd seen it before on men who'd come back from places that never made the news. What would you have done in that moment? Would you have spoken up and risked a reprimand? Or would you have stayed quiet and trusted your instincts to keep you alive? Savannah chose to act without announcing it. She spotted a faint shimmer of reflected light off a distant piece of glass, too brief to be natural. A scout was watching them from the high ground. Sterling continued to shout his position to anyone within a mile, oblivious. "Sterling," Savannah said, her voice low and cutting. "We need to break contact and move to high ground on the left. Now." The lieutenant froze, his face reddening. "You don't give orders here, Vance," he spat. "You follow them. Right now, I'm telling you to move." The team watched in heavy silence as the two faced off in the narrow pass. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint, unmistakable scent of wood smoke from a nearby hidden camp. Malik was close. He was ready for them to walk straight into his sights. Savannah reached up with a slow, deliberate motion and adjusted a small, unmarked patch on her left shoulder. Its edges were frayed from years of hard use in the field. To an outsider, it was just a darkened piece of nylon with a faint, charcoal gray ghost printed on it. Only a handful of operators in the entire USA military would recognize that design. It wasn't a standard unit insignia found in any manual or at any base exchange. It was earned in places that did not officially exist on any map. Staff Sergeant Miller caught the movement from the corner of his eye, his brow furrowing as he studied the patch. 15 years in the infantry had taught him that the most dangerous people rarely wore the loudest colors. He began to suspect that her record was hiding something far deeper than a few overseas deployments. The air around them grew heavy, the scent of ozone and wet stone replacing the dry afternoon dust. Savannah didn't look at the sky. She looked at the way light was refracting off the distant jagged peaks and felt a subtle shift in barometric pressure against her skin, an internal sensor honed by 1,000 cold mornings at the glass. Without a word, she reached for the windage turret of her rifle. Her movements were mechanical and precise, a rhythmic series of soft metallic clicks. 1, 2, 3. She dialed in the adjustment with a confidence that looked almost supernatural to the men watching. "The wind is holding steady, Vance," Miller whispered, genuinely curious. "Why are you adjusting for a crosswind that isn't there?" "It will be here in 2 minutes," she replied, her voice flat and certain. She didn't offer an explanation or a weather report. She simply stated it as fact. Exactly 120 seconds later, a sharp gust tore through the canyon, whistling through the gaps in the rock. It was a sudden, violent shift that would have thrown a standard shot off by at least 3 feet at long range. The rest of the team stumbled. Savannah remained perfectly still. Miller looked at her with mounting respect, realizing she had predicted the atmospheric shift with the accuracy of a ballistic computer. He wondered what else she was seeing that the rest of them were completely missing. Back at the FOB, there was a digital file buried deep within the encrypted personnel servers. It required a level of clearance far above what a lieutenant like Sterling possessed. Inside were pages of redacted commendations, names of locations and dates hidden behind thick black bars, from missions that never made the evening news and never would. Savannah never mentioned the folder. She carried no pride in the medals she wasn't allowed to wear. She lived in the quiet space between a trigger pull and an impact, a place where rank and ego simply did not exist. She felt the weight of a small, smooth stone in the pocket of her tactical vest, taken from the crate behind her father's house many years ago. It was a grounding reminder of his lessons: patience, restraint, and the heavy, irreversible cost of a single bullet. The unit rounded a sharp corner in the canyon and walked straight into a kill zone. A single, high-pitched crack echoed through the ravine, followed immediately by the sound of a bullet shattering a rock inches from Lieutenant Sterling's head. "Sniper. Get down. Get to cover now." Sterling screamed, his voice cracking with adrenaline. The team scrambled behind jagged outcrops of shale, the smell of pulverized stone and cordite filling the narrow pass. Another shot rang out, pinning them against the cold rock faces. The enemy scout was perched high on a ridge at least 600 meters away, covering their only path of retreat. Sterling fumbled with his binoculars, hands shaking. "I can't find the flash." He yelled over the wind. Then something shifted in him. Sterling did a quick mental inventory of his team's position and called out a flanking route to Miller. Tight, efficient, exactly right. It wasn't heroic, but it was competent, and it showed Savannah that under the loudmouth, there was a soldier who hadn't forgotten everything he'd been taught. She noted it without a word. But moving to that flank without eliminating the scout first would get them all killed. That was her job. Savannah was already prone, her body melting into the shadows of a low ledge. She didn't reach for her binoculars. She used her naked eye to scan for the subtle tells of the mountain. She saw it, a tiny, unnatural flicker of movement near a cluster of stunted juniper trees. Not the scout's rifle. The thin, metallic antenna of a radio reflecting the harsh midday sun. "Target acquired," Savannah said, her voice a calm anchor in the growing panic. She began the mechanical process of preparing for the shot, her movements fluid and devoid of wasted energy. Sterling crawled toward her, face pale and covered in gray dust. "Range him, Vance. Take him out before he calls in a mortar strike." Savannah ignored the command, her focus entirely on the small black radio sitting on a rock beside the scout. She knew that killing him now would only alert Malik's main force the moment the scout missed a check-in. A dead man's signal was just as loud as a live one. She adjusted her scope, fingers dancing over the turrets with the precision of a surgeon. She was calculating for high-density altitude and a shifting crosswind gusting at 12 miles per hour. She pulled the trigger. The suppressed rifle gave a muffled thud that the mountain swallowed whole. 500 yards away, the scout's radio exploded into a cloud of plastic and copper wire, one piece of lead. One clean solution. The scout dived for cover, frantically reaching for a communication device that no longer existed. He was blind and mute, unable to warn Malik or call for the fire mission Sterling had feared. For a long moment, the canyon was deathly still. The men looked at each other, the reality of the shot slowly sinking in. Sterling stared through his glass, mouth hanging open. You missed the man," he stammered. "I didn't miss," Savannah replied, slowly cycling a fresh round into the chamber. She kept her eyes on the ridgeline, watching the scout retreat in a panic. Miller crawled up beside her, eyes wide. "That was a 600-meter shot through a canyon crosswind, and you hit a target the size of a cigarette pack." "Why the radio, Vance?" he asked, his voice low with a new kind of respect. "If I kill him, Malik knows exactly where we are the moment the scout misses his check-in," she explained, calm and instructional. "By taking the radio, I've cut his tongue out. He has to run 3 miles back to camp to report us. That gives us a 20-minute window to move to high ground." She pointed toward a series of depressions in the rock leading toward the summit. "The air is thinner up there, but the density altitude will actually improve bullet stability for the next phase. The spindrift was pulling left by 4 inches at that range," she added. "I held 2 mils high to compensate for the 3-degree incline and the cooling air temperature in the shadows." The team processed the depth of what they had just witnessed. They realized she wasn't just a girl with a rifle. She was a master of the final outcome, a ghost who saw the battlefield in equations and probabilities. Sterling didn't say another word about participation trophies. He simply nodded, a hollowed-out look in his eyes, as he understood he was no longer the most capable person in the unit. "Moving in 30 seconds, Savannah commanded, and for the first time, every man in the file moved without hesitation. The unit crested the final overlook, the summit of the jagged ridge offering a panoramic view of the valley below. The air was frigid here, tasting of ancient ice and exhausted lungs. Savannah felt the vibration of the radio against her chest before the voice even crackled through her encrypted headset. A voice cut through the white noise, deep, gravelly, carrying the unmistakable weight of decades of command. "General Silas Thorne. Ghost, is that you on point?" the general asked. His tone had shifted from tactical to something deeply human and deliberate. This was not a coincidence. Recognition. Thorne had been monitoring the operation's comms since the ambush contact. He had flagged the suppressed shot pattern, cross-referenced it with known operator profiles in the database, and matched it against a redacted file that only cleared personnel could access. He knew exactly who was on that ridge. Savannah keyed the mic. "Affirmative, sir. We have eyes on the objective." "I thought they retired that call sign after the final stand in the Korengal," Thorne said, his voice carrying a sudden weight. "My son would be a name on a wall if it weren't for the operative who held that position alone for 6 hours. The lieutenant froze. The mocking sneer he had worn all day vanished, replaced by pale-faced shock. He looked at Savannah, truly seeing her for the first time. Not as a token, not as a trope. As a living record of a mission so classified he would never read the full account. The redacted lines of her file were not bureaucratic formality. They were the names of men who came home because of her. Sterling's mouth opened. The general's tone of absolute respect silenced him before a single word could form. Savannah didn't acknowledge the shift. Her gaze remained fixed on the valley where Malik was moving. She was still the same professional she had been at the bottom of that mountain. The mission was not finished. The team stood in a heavy, reverent stillness. They finally understood that the most dangerous person among them was the one who had never once felt the need to prove it. Savannah adjusted her cheek weld against the cold composite stock of her rifle, her eye glued to the high magnification glass. Below, in the shaded courtyard of an ancient stone compound, Malik finally emerged from the heavy shadows. The scent of wild thyme and dry shale blew upward on a cold gust, mixing with the metallic tang of rifle oil. Malik was not alone. 3 men in traditional robes, carrying no visible weapons, walked toward him with a hesitant, formal grace. Through her optic, Savannah saw the delicate embroidery on their shawls, the unmistakable mark of regional peace brokers from the northern provinces. She studied Malik through the glass. He moved with an unsettling stillness, the kind that did not come from calm, but from rehearsal. His left hand carried a folded document. His right hand never moved far from his side. Around his wrist, a string of dark prayer beads hung motionless despite the wind. as though even the mountain air knew not to disturb him. He did not look at the brokers when they approached. He looked at the rooftops. The intelligence footnote from the briefing 2 days ago detonated in her memory like a slow-burn fuse finally reaching the charge. Malik had made initial contact with Northern representatives 48 hours ago. This was not a random meeting. It was a staged moment, carefully designed so that the next few seconds could be blamed on someone else. Target confirmed. "Take the shot, Vance. Take it now." Sterling hissed into his headset, watching through binoculars from the ledge. He did not have the clarity of her precision glass. Savannah's finger rested lightly on the cold steel of the trigger, her heart rate slowing to a steady thrum. She saw Malik reach for a document, not a sidearm. His movements were deliberate and clearly visible to the brokers. If she fired now, the entire region would watch a USA sniper assassinate a leader in the middle of a peaceful negotiation. The decision was not just about a body count. It was about the 100,000 lives that would be consumed by the war that followed such a move. "Negative, Lieutenant. The contacts are regional peace brokers," Savannah said, her voice a wall of absolute tactical certainty. "I am giving you a direct order, Sergeant. Eliminate the target." Sterling's voice rose to a muffled shout, blind rage overtaking the brief competence he had shown on the mountain. What would you have done in that moment? Would you have followed the loud, panicked order of a superior, or the truth revealed through the glass? Savannah did not blink. She scanned the surrounding rooftops with mechanical efficiency. There, on a crumbling balcony 200 yards behind the peace brokers, she saw a ghost of movement. A second sniper, draped in a local rug to mask his heat signature, was leveling a long-barreled rifle at the lead broker. Malik had not come to negotiate. He had come to be the witness to an assassination he could blame on the USA. The trap was elegant, patient, and nearly perfect. Savannah shifted her aim. The movement was so fluid the rifle seemed like a natural extension of her nervous system. She ignored Sterling's continued screaming and focused entirely on the hidden assassin's breath cycle, the final half-second before he committed to the shot. She dialed for the distance of the far balcony and calculated the lead for a target already beginning to squeeze his own trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder with a suppressed thud swallowed by the peaks. 500 yards away, the hidden assassin was knocked backward. Malik and the brokers dived for cover. The negotiation shattered, but the spark of a full-scale war remained unlit. Savannah exhaled a long, slow breath, the scent of spent powder drifting up from the chamber. She did not look for praise. She simply watched the courtyard clear through the settling dust. Sterling was silent now, binoculars lowered. He looked at the ghost patch on her shoulder and felt a cold, humbling realization settle into his chest. She had not just saved the mission. She had saved his soul from a mistake he could never have taken back. Miller placed a hand briefly on her shoulder, a gesture of profound, unspoken respect. The woman they had dismissed as a participation trophy had seen what no one else could, and made the final decision her father had prepared her for so many years ago in those cold Appalachian mountains. Back at the FOB, Savannah sat on the edge of her bunk, the sharp, medicinal scent of rifle bore cleaner filling the small, dim room. She moved a soft cloth along the steel of her bolt carrier with a slow, meditative precision, her hands perfectly steady. The rhythmic metallic click of the parts coming back together was the only sound in the quiet space. She didn't head to the mess hall to tell war stories or wait for acknowledgement from the rest of the team. She preferred the routine of gear maintenance, letting the adrenaline of the high peaks slowly bleed away into the desert night. To Savannah, the mission was a job completed, not a trophy to be displayed. Lieutenant Sterling walked past her quarters, stopping for a brief moment in the doorway. He looked at the floor, devoid of the arrogance that had defined him all day. He didn't say a word. The subtle, stiff nod he gave her was a deeper acknowledgement than any speech could offer. The weight of her choice in the valley was a burden she would carry alone, far from the official reports and redacted files. Real courage is not the willingness to pull the trigger. It is the strength to stay your hand when every voice around you is screaming to fire. Savannah had understood that the most consequential trigger is often the one you choose not to pull. She thought of the peace brokers and the fragile negotiation she had protected with a single, calculated shot at a target nobody had briefed her to find. Her father had taught her that the rifle is a tool for precision, but the mind is the tool for peace. When the bore cleaner was dry and the bolt seated back into the receiver with a final soft click, she reached into the pocket of her tactical vest and set the small, smooth stone from her father's creek on the edge of the bunk beside her. She looked at it for a long moment. Outside, the desert wind pressed against the walls of the FOB and said nothing. Somewhere on the other side of those mountains, families were sitting down to dinner without knowing how close the world had come to burning. They would never know her name. That was exactly how she wanted it. The narrator reflects on the final choice made that day, one that prevented a regional fire from consuming the lives of thousands of USA service members. It was a victory won in the quiet space of a heartbeat, far from the eyes of the world. Savannah Vance remained a ghost, her legacy written in the wars that never happened and the families who would never have to mourn. Sometimes the quietest soldiers carry the loudest legacies. The jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush are quiet once more, holding the secrets of a conflict that was never allowed to ignite. Savannah Vance has returned to the shadows of the FOB, a ghost who understands that true power is the strength to stay your hand. In the high-stakes world of long-range glass and heavy triggers, the most lethal weapon is a soldier who thinks beyond the immediate moment. We hope this story has given you a new respect for those who stand the lonely watch. Your support helps us share these stories of the final decisions that define the brave. Every like and share ensures the legacy of the Moss professional is never forgotten by the next generation of warriors.